Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster. This is Chapter 28, The Railroad Unions. Ever since its birth about 100 years ago, the railroad industry, heart of the American industrial system, has been exploited for the enrichment of its private owners. The portion of the workers has always been long hours, low pay, unemployment, and bad working conditions, while the owners of the industry, who perform no useful service in its operation, have reaped billions and billions in wealth. The workers have always had to fight for self-preservation against the voracious sharks who own the railroads, and whatever modest successes they have achieved in defending and improving their living and working standards have been won only at the cost of unremitting struggle. Since the close of the World War in 1918, the railroad industry, which was then already highly efficient, has made further great strides in this respect. But the advantages of this increasing productivity have not gone to the railroad workers. More than ever, they suffer from excessive work, mass unemployment, and low standards of living, while into the hands of the owners, the rich stream of unearned wealth continues to flow in billions. This one-sided prosperity is the situation that confronts the railroad workers, and the 21 standard railroad craft unions, with their ultra-conservative leaders and policies, have not been able basically to alter it. A militant trade union policy. If railroad workers are to make real headway toward improving their conditions, drastic improvements will have to be made in the makeup and conduct of the railroad trade unions. And the first betterment in this respect should be the development of a more militant policy. Labor unions are fighting organizations. Their effectiveness in winning concessions for their members in a given political situation depends directly upon their ability, if need be, to bring production to a standstill. When the employers fear the striking power of a union, they make concessions to it, and only then. Unions, therefore, must cultivate their ability to strike effectively, but of course, they should use the strike weapon judiciously. Fancy arguments by leaders, reliance upon arbitration, or upon the goodwill of employers, and other such maneuvers, can be no substitute for powerful and militant unionism. The railroad workers, true to this principle, have a long record of militant struggle. Among their many battles for justice were the Great National Strike of 1877, the American Railway Union Strike of 1894 led by Debs, the Illinois Central Harriman Strike of 1911 to 1915, the 1916 strike movement of the Four Brotherhoods for the 8-hour day, the Outlaw Shopmen's Strike of 1919, the Outlaw Switchmen's Strike of 1920, the National Shopmen's Strike of 1922, and scores of individual craft strikes on various railroads in recent years. The top leaders of the railroad craft unions seem to have completely forgotten that labor unions are fighting bodies, if they ever knew it. They work on the false theory that the interests of the workers are identical with, or rather subordinate to, those of the railroad owners. Their line of policy is to conciliate the railroad companies, not militantly to defend the interests of the workers. For many years, with justice, the communists have been pointing out this situation, and now their assertions are borne out by devastating charges made by President A.F. Whitney of the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen. In the official journal of that organization for July 1937, he makes the sharpest attack on the policy of the railroad union leaders that has appeared in the official union press for a generation. Says President Whitney, "In recent years there has developed a philosophy within the Railway Labor Executives Association to the effect that railway labor should surrender its democratic rights to petition the government for just legislation and should circumscribe its activities by carrier limitation. In other words, this means that the railroad union leaders have been shielding the interests of the railroad owners and not fighting vigorously for the demands of the workers." President Whitney, in his article, gives many proofs of this fact, and the history of railroad unions for 20 years past, not to go further back, tells the same story. Let us learn a few lessons from that history. During the World War, the railroad workers built up a very powerful organization of some 1,800,000 members. It was militant and progressive. Under the big mass upsurge of that period, the railroad unions were developing a greater and greater solidarity through local, system, divisional, and national federations. And, with their plum plan and intensive political activities, they constituted the progressive wing of the whole American labor movement. This situation naturally greatly alarmed the railroad companies, and they proceeded, with the help of their labor leader friends, to undermine the fighting spirit of the powerful railroad unions. Their aim was especially to take away the strike weapon of the unions, for the companies dreaded the economic power of the strongly organized workers in the key railroad industry. The first long step toward eliminating the strike among railroad workers was the passage of the Transportation Act, with the union leaders' support, in 1920. This law crippled the railroad unions by placing them under the hostile Railway Labor Board, which set about actively to worsen conditions for the workers. The workers rebelled against it, and the great national strikes of the outlaw switchmen of 1920 and of 400,000 shopmen in 1922 resulted. The union leaders ruthlessly broke the first of these strikes and failed to support the legal shopmen's strike solidly, several of the unions remaining at work while the rest were striking. The consequence was a very disastrous defeat which cost the railroad unions several 100,000 members and gravely weakened their power and progressive character. The railroad leaders made the effects of this disaster worse by adopting, in 1923, the notorious B&O plan of union management cooperation. The theory of this scheme was that strikes were unnecessary, that all the workers had to do was to speed up production and their steady work and high wages would automatically result. The general consequence was to worsen working conditions, to further destroy the militancy of the unions, to turn them into speed-up agencies of the bosses, and thus to contribute to the general overproduction that caused the great industrial crash of October 1929. Together with the disastrous B&O Plan no-strike policy, the union leaders developed labor banking. This was another cure-all substitute for militant union policies. As every railroader knows, it finally wound up in one of the worst financial scandals in the history of the United States, with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers membership losing some $17 million. Not satisfied with the undermining effect of all these anti-strike tendencies, the railroad companies proceeded, again with the open support of the railroad union leadership, more completely to hogtie the railroad workers by the passage in 1926 of the Railway Labor Act, then popularly known as the Watson-Parker Law. This act, with its tangle of mediation, arbitration, and delay, which 6 years later was made still worse by amendments, further seriously weakened the strike right of the railroad workers and made arbitration semi-compulsory. The railroad union leaders hailed the Watson-Parker Law as a great victory, but the communists denounced it correctly as highly injurious to railroad unionism, and they were condemned and expelled from the unions for doing so. In a pamphlet I wrote at the time, I said that this law virtually fastens compulsory arbitration upon the necks of the railroad workers. It outlaws strikes. The WP law is a blow at the vitals of railroad unionism. And so it has turned out in fact. Between the effects of the semi-compulsory arbitration of the Railway Labor Act and the non-militant attitude of the union leaders, the 21 railroad unions have sunk deeply into a no-strike program. They have also developed other reactionary tendencies. From being the progressive head of the labor movement, as they were in 1920, they have become its tail end. True, the railroad union leaders talk big, adopt radical demands, and take strike votes. Such maneuvers may fool some workers, but certainly the companies are not deceived by them. The railroad owners know that when they say no, the union leaders subside. The employers even sneer about it in their trade journals. Said the Wall Street Journal recently, "No one supposes that strike votes mean a strike. Things don't happen that way in the railroad industry." Some recent railroad experiences. The notorious anti-labor sheet, the Chicago Tribune, August 7th, scoffs at the no-strike policy of the unions thus. 20 years ago, the threat of a railway walkout would have been front-page news. Businessmen would have been frantically facing a nationwide stoppage of industry. It would have been a national crisis equal only to the prospect of war. Today, a strike vote is merely a ripple in the course of events, and the membership of the Brotherhood scarcely take it seriously. In recent labor history, there are many more examples to be found of the harmfulness of the railroad union leaders' refusal to fight the employers. Thus, in the depth of the industrial crisis, when millions of workers were on the brink of starvation, the railroad union leaders were even more energetic than the company officials, from whom they took their tip, in denouncing unemployment insurance and substantial work relief programs. Together with President Greene and the other reactionary moguls of the AFL, they declared that the establishment of federal unemployment insurance would degrade the American working man and destroy the trade union movement. If, since then, progress had been made toward instituting government unemployment insurance, the railroad union leaders are not entitled to a particle of credit for it. It was the communists and other militants who made the real fight for this fundamental reform. Then there was the 1932 wage cut in which the railroad unions led the wage reduction retreat of the general labor movement. President Whitney tells a scandalous story about that. He declares in his article in the Railroad Trainmen that in the face of the distress then prevailing, the union leaders proposed a conference with the companies to provide relief for unemployed railroad workers. But, says Whitney, the only thing that came out of this conference, which was originally designed by the Railway Labor Executives Association to give relief to employers, was a 10% cut payroll reduction. This constituted a gift of $400 million out of the workers' pockets to the companies before the reduction was eventually canceled. And this cancellation was brought about not by efforts of the union leaders, but by mass pressure of the workers, a movement in which the rank-and-file Railroad Brotherhood Unity movement played a big part. The non-struggle policy of the railroad union leaders was further illustrated in the matter of old age pensions. It was not they who initiated the pension movement. That was done by the rank-and-file Railroad Employees National Pension Association. The railroad companies frowned upon the idea of a federal pension system, so, of course, the union leaders were also cold toward it. It was only when the railroad workers' sentiment for pensions was almost universal that they came forward with a much inferior bill to that proposed by the RENPA. And in the recent amendments to the Railroad Retirement Act, the pension law, so says President Whitney, needless concessions were made to the companies that will cost the workers many millions yearly. The case of the dismissal wage agreement was another example of the union leaders yielding before the demands of the companies. The owners demanded consolidation principally so that they could knock some 250,000 railroad workers out of jobs. As usual, the union leaders fell in with their plan. Instead of making a last-ditch resistance against any loss of employment through consolidation, they, while making much anti-consolidation talk, surrendered to the companies by accepting the miserable dismissal wage in return for throwing large numbers of workers out of work. Then they hailed their retreat as a wonderful victory. This dismissal wage business will return sorely to plague railroad workers when the industry goes slack again and the companies vigorously take up once more their consolidation plans. Chairman Carroll of the Interstate Commerce Commission is now demanding that all the roads be combined into one unified national system. President Roosevelt has also recently strongly advocated consolidation. The whole dismissal wage agreement should be scrapped. The sham battle conducted by the railroad union leaders around the question of the 6-hour day is still another example of their weak policy. To kid the workers, they have talked loudly about this issue, but they have done nothing to realize it in the several years since it was adopted as policy by the railroad unions. And now we have the deplorable spectacle of President Harrison of the Railway Labor Executives Association agreeing with the companies, in view of the then pending wage negotiations, not to insist upon the 6-hour bill at this session of Congress. President Whitney is right when he says, This Harrison Phillips philosophy of attempting to surrender the democratic rights of railroad workers to seek desirable legislation in the name of reaching agreements with their carriers will ultimately lead to the destruction of the organized labor movement if continued. The union leaders threw overboard the 6-hour day and other important legislation, presumably in the interests of getting the men a favorable wage increase. But the wage agreement also turns out to be just one more instance of yielding before the powerful railroad corporation's demands. As we have already remarked above, the August 1937 wage increases were so low that they did not even keep pace with the rising cost of living. They were the very minimum that the workers could be temporarily forced to accept by the combined pressure of the companies and the union leaders. The need of a vigorous policy. This constant surrender of the union leaders before the companies registers itself in bad wages, hours, and working conditions for railroad workers. It must be stopped. The railroad unions should begin to function again as real labor organizations. The railroad workers are powerfully situated in industry. Their power is tremendous. With a militant policy, they can extract many additional concessions from the avaricious companies. The railroad workers must reconquer the right to strike, which has been surrendered by their leaders. Railroad workers, like all others, may be depended upon to use the strike right intelligently and judiciously. The anti-strike provisions of the Railway Labor Act should be repealed. The railroad union leaders who persist in being so careful of the railroad owners' interests should be supplanted by men who look to their own union membership for instruction. The whole history of the labor movement proves that the workers get concessions from their employers only to the extent that they are able and willing to fight for them. For example, in 1916, the four brotherhoods won the basic 8-hour day by a strike movement. Tiring of the company's opposition and the politicians' delay, they set September 4th as the strike date. But Congress hurriedly passed the Adamson Law on September 2nd, 2 days before the strike deadline. Compare this militant policy and its real results with the present empty, endless dilly-dallying over the 6-hour day bill. Or take the question of company unionism. For years, with all their arbitration and other folderols under the Railway Labor Act, the railroad union leaders were quite unable to eliminate company unionism from the railroads. It was only with the development of the great organizing campaigns, strikes, and intensive political activities of the CIO, which reflected themselves among the railroad workers and shook some life into the railroad unions, that real progress is finally being made to end the menace of company unionism on the railroads, as well as in industry generally. The whole brilliant success of the CIO emphasizes afresh the correctness of militant union policies. It is high time that the railroad unions wake up and cut themselves loose from the strangling meshes of the Railway Labor Act. This law should be changed to strike out all its semi-compulsory arbitration features. Meanwhile, the railroad unions should adopt a line of vigorous action on both the industrial and political fields. Such a policy will translate itself into higher living standards, better jobs, and greater security for railroad workers, as well as in an enormous strengthening of the whole labor movement. National Federation of All Railroad Workers. The railroads, as we have pointed out above, are a low-wage industry, despite the tremendous potential economic power of the unions. President Harrison of the Railway Labor Executive Association has stated that the average wage of the members of the 14 non-trained service unions after the 1937 wage increase is only 64 cents per hour, as compared with auto 90 cents, steel 82.5 cents, rubber 83 cents, tires and tubes 92.5 cents, etc., all of the latter being industries where the CIO is strong. In the previous chapter, we have seen the basic cause why this low-wage condition prevails on the railroads, namely the no-strike policy and subservient attitude of the union leaders toward the railroad companies. Now we shall examine another elementary reason, that is, the horse and buggy system of 21 autonomous craft unions which exist on the railroads and which vastly reduces the strength of the workers. The railroad companies are powerful, united, and ruthless. They are controlled by the greatest combination of capitalists in all the world. In her notable book, Rulers of America, Anna Rochester says, "No section of American industrial life has reached a more advanced stage of capitalist development than the railroads. Here we find highly developed monopoly and an open and far-reaching use of the state on behalf of corporations. There are 19 major systems, controlling directly or indirectly nearly 90% of the total mileage in the United States. Concentration of railroad power is even greater than this figure implies, for back of the 13 major systems and the 8 smaller systems is the dominating power of Morgan and Kuhn, Loeb. The great house of Morgan, together with its Kuhn Loeb, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, DuPont, and other affiliates, dominates not only the railroads, but also many other industries, including steel, automobile, munitions, public utilities, and coal mining, as well as various big banking and commercial enterprises. The gigantic Morgan financial octopus directly controls capitalist interests of $30 billion. It is closely linked to another 16 billions, has influence over 16.5 additional billions, and is allied to 15 billion more. Thus, the Morgan Group either directly controls or actually dominates some $77 billion of capital, or more than 1/4 of the American corporate wealth. It is against this monstrous, ruthless, united capitalist aggregation that the union representatives have to contend when they sit down in conference with representatives of the Association of American Railroads. The capitalist wolves may fight among themselves for ownership of the industries, but they present a united front against labor. And what kind of an industrial organization do the railroad workers possess as against the gigantic power of the banker owners of the railroad industry? The answer is a disgrace and a disaster to the whole labor movement. 21 weak, squabbling, autonomous craft unions. It is a mosquito fleet of canoes trying to fight a great battleship. Small wonder, then, that the railroad workers do not get better results from their labor unions. The need for a united organization. For 40 years or more, the most progressive railroad workers have realized the burning necessity for greater solidarity and a more compact form of organization. They understood the utter folly of single craft unions, or separate groups of such unions, trying to fight the powerful and united combination of railroad corporations. Such a stupid course has led to lost strikes and defeated wage negotiations time after time. Consequently, ever since the days of Debs and the American Railway Union in 1893-94, the progressives have striven to develop a more unified railroad unionism. The companies, of course, have always violently opposed these labor unity tendencies, and consequently, inasmuch as it is the union leaders' policy to sneeze every time the railroad owners catch a cold, they too have set their faces like flint against consolidation of the railroad craft unions and the development of concerted action among them. Indeed, some years ago, there was the absurd spectacle presented of the railroad union leaders, their own organizations scattered and disunited, carrying on a vigorous campaign for the amalgamation of the railroad companies. Their arguments on how and why the employers should consolidate are contained in a high-priced report submitted in 1921 to the Railroad Labor Board by W. Jet Lauck on behalf of the Railway Employees Department of the AFL. In this most untimely report, the advantage of unity of the railroad systems was stressed, and opponents of it were condemned as reactionaries motivated only by matters of personal advantage. The railroad union leaders would, instead, have done much better had they planned the unification of railroad unionism and taken upon themselves the criticism that they directed to the opponents of unity of the railroad systems. At the time of the Great Strike disaster of 1922, when the running trades worked while the shop trade struck and thus all were defeated, the Communist Party and the Trade Union Educational League initiated a broad campaign for the amalgamation of the craft unions into one industrial union. This timely proposal was endorsed by a majority of the rank-and-file workers generally in the railroad crafts, but the union leaders, by reason of their ironclad, undemocratic grip on the unions, defeated the movement. These same railroad union leaders have also castrated and frustrated the Federation movement on the railroads. Federation sprang up on a large scale several years prior to the war as a result of progressive rank-and-file activity. It set about linking together the various craft unions, and the Great I.C. Harriman Lines strike of 1911 to 1915 was fought over the issue of Federation recognition by the companies. The Federation movement prospered, however, in spite of railroad opposition, and it gradually spread all over the country. This resulted in the organization of the Railway Employees Department of the AFL, and, during the war and shortly afterwards, climaxed in various joint national movements of all the railroad unions and the signing of the all-inclusive National Wage Agreement. In many respects, it was of a broad, rank-and-file democratic character. The railroad union leaders, with a few notable exceptions, sabotaged the Federation movement from the outset. They saw that its logical result would be to draw the unions closer and closer, until finally they become a compact organization. And this was precisely the last thing that the railroads and their friends, the Grand Chiefs, wanted. So they proceeded to sidetrack the whole Federation movement. Their attack on Federation was twofold. Especially following the 1922 defeat, they systematically set about weakening the local, system, division, and national federations by letting some fall to pieces altogether, and by undermining the rest in various ways. Then they proceeded to develop a substitute for the whole Federation movement. This substitute, worthless like most substitutes, is the present Railway Labor Executives Association. This body, consisting nationally of the presidents of the 21 railroad unions, has its counterparts in the Association of General Chairmen on various railroad systems. Among other things, the Railway Labor Executive Association has gutted the Railway Employees Department and left it virtually without any functions. The RLEA is a form that reduces rank-and-file control of the railroad unions and the solidarity of the workers to a minimum. It has been a convenient instrument to prevent the workers from making any real struggle against the railroad companies. The great success of the CIO in organizing the steel, auto, and other industries on the basis of industrial unionism has again caused a new growth of militancy and solidarity among railroad workers. One important manifestation of this is the so-called local associations movement, now developing in many railroad centers. The movement, despite its similarity of name, is unlike the system of national associations of general chairmen and grand chiefs, in that it is a genuine attempt to link all the various crafts on a given railroad system or important railroad center into one broad representative body. It is not a substitute for federation, but a builder and developer of it, and a wide path to the solidarity of all railroad workers. In order to head off this new progressive movement for solidarity of all railroad workers, the leaders of the Railway Employees Department recently issued a leaflet graphically picturing the 21 railroad organizations as constituting one great unbreakable chain, the Railway Labor Executive Association. This was a brazen attempt to kid railroaders into believing that they too have an industrial union. Such an argument is an insult to the intelligence of railroad workers. What kind of a chain is it in which each link has the power to leave the chain or yield to pressure whenever it sees fit? A chain is no stronger than its weakest link, and the Railway Labor Executives Association is a whole chain of weak links. In fact, its links are not actually joined together at all. The 1937 wage negotiations showed once again the falsity of the claim that the RLEA is an unbreakable chain. Here we saw two quite separate groups of unions, one composed of the 5 running trades and the other made up of 14 non-trained service organizations, and each carrying on entirely distinct wage negotiations. This separation injured the interests of both groups. Suppose it turned out that one group had refused to accept the company's final proposals and declared a strike. Then we would have 1922 all over again, with part of the unions striking and the rest working and helping the employers to break the strike. Railroad workers have had enough of such criminal craft union stupidity. They want a consolidation of their union forces that will bring them into a united front against the powerful railroad combine. What kind of a railroad federation? What is urgently necessary is to join together all the railroad craft unions into one well-knit national federation. This federation should be based upon the acceptance of three general principles by the affiliated organizations. One national wage agreement for all railroad workers. The federation should finally formulate the workers' demands and be in charge of all negotiations with the railroad companies in support of these demands. The decision as to whether the workers should strike or not in a given situation to rest solely within the jurisdiction of the federation. A federation founded upon these three elementary principles would lay the basis for real solidarity and united action among the railroad workers. It would enormously increase their power as a whole. In all other respects, in the beginning at least, the unions affiliated to the Industrial Federation could retain their autonomy, holding their own conventions, electing their officers, formulating their craft demands, enforcing the agreement in their respective spheres, conducting their insurance systems, collecting their own rates of dues, etc. The effectiveness of this type of organization is shown by the successes achieved in the past 4 years by the Maritime Federation on the Pacific Coast. The way to bring about such a national industrial federation of railroad workers is by developing the already existing principle and practice of federation on the railroads. All the international railroad unions should be hooked together nationally in a broad federation. The local, system, and divisional federation should also be expanded to include all railroad unions, and there should be built up all-inclusive railroad councils in every city or town with 2 or more railroads. Cultivation of the new local associations movement is an important step in this general direction. All the leading committees and conventions of the various stages of the National Railroad Federation should be based on a broad rank-and-file representation and not be merely little handfuls of officials, as in the case of the Railway Labor Executives Association and its associated system chairman. All the national unions, local, system, and divisional organizations, and local railroad councils should send delegates to biennial conventions of the great National Industrial Federation. From the workers' standpoint, there is every reason why the railroad unions should be joined together in such a federation. It would mean more wages and better working conditions for the workers, the certainty of making the railroads 100% union, the making of vast economies in union administration, etc. The only objections against such a federation are the fears of the companies of its great power and the dread of the union officials that it might disturb their too well-paid jobs. The old horse-chestnut argument that such a broad federation could not properly take care of the interests of all the groups of workers is thoroughly discredited by experience in many industries. It was also shown to be false in the railroad industry itself by the former National Railroad Wage Agreements, 1920, which covered all railroad unions and all categories of railroad workers. In addition to linking the railroad unions in this federated form, there should also be a process started of amalgamating the most closely related unions. This would also lend added great strength to the whole railroad movement. Thus the Order of Railway Conductors, Brotherhood of Railway Trainmen, and Switchmen's Union of North America should be combined into one union. The leaders have been preventing this obviously necessary amalgamation for 30 years. And the same is also true of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Engineers, which, but for official opposition, should have naturally fused together a generation ago. Several of the metal trades unions should also be combined to the benefit of all. The 2 Negro organizations of Pullman porters and dining car employees should likewise be combined. In short, by amalgamation the number of unions could, with great profit, be cut at least in half at once. Then the double process of federation and amalgamation should be continued until it reaches its logical conclusion, the eventual development of a great departmentalized industrial union of all railroad workers. With such a united organization, the railroad workers would indeed be a power in the land. The CIO has demonstrated the worth of industrial unionism in the steel, auto, rubber, and other industries. This form of organization will also prove no less valuable in the railroad industry. The railroad workers, whether in their present craft form of organization or in later stages of federation and amalgamation, should also enter into close cooperative arrangements with the unions of maritime, truck, bus, trolley, and aircraft workers. with the aim of eventually establishing a great wide federation of all transport workers. The railroad companies are trying to lead railroaders into fighting other transport workers as competitors and enemies. But the railroaders must not be so trapped. All transport workers have interests in common against the great transport capitalists, and they should all stand shoulder to shoulder. More trade union democracy needed. Besides federating and amalgamating the railroad unions, they also stand in urgent need of democratization. Such democratization will modernize and strengthen them. Among the more basic measures necessary to this effect are 1. The shameful discrimination against the large body of Negro railroad workers must be discontinued. There are more than 125,000 Negroes employed in the railroad industry. They are grossly abused by the companies, being forced to accept the worst jobs and the lowest pay. In time of unemployment, they are the first fired and the last hired. Many railroad unions condone and assist this outrageous Jim Crow system by refusing to allow the Negroes to become union members and to give them organized protection. This condition is a disgrace to the labor movement and a grievous injury to both white and Negro railroad workers. It must be ended, and the hand of democratic union fellowship extended to the doubly oppressed Negro workers. 2. A more progressive, democratic, and intelligent attitude must also be taken towards women and young workers in the railroad industry. They should be allowed freely to join the unions, their grievances should be carefully looked after, and special methods to organize and educate them need to be developed. 3. Unemployed railroad workers should also be retained as union members. This will greatly stimulate the unions to fight for their rights. One of the most shameful features of the great industrial crisis was the ruthless way in which the railroad and other craft union officials dropped the starving unemployed from the membership rolls. 4. The railroad unions also have a crying need for democracy in the conduct of their business. With but rare exceptions, the organizations are dominated by small groups of entrenched officials at the top, and the rank and file have little real say in the actual running of the organizations. This was seen once again by the way the recent wage settlements were railroaded through, without the workers being allowed to vote on them, and in spite of widespread protest. The Chicago Conference of General Chairmen that accepted the recent wage increase of the 14 non-operating unions was a shocking example of bureaucratic domination. First, the general chairmen were given no previous inkling of the nature of the settlement until they heard Harrison report it at the meeting. Then they were not allowed to discuss the matter in the meeting, as the gathering was at once broken up into crafts, where various means of pressure were used to whip disgruntled chairmen into line. Among these means of coercion were threats to leave out of the settlement altogether any craft that voted against accepting its present terms, lying assertions that the strike vote did not have a majority, etc. By such undemocratic means was the inadequate settlement rammed down the throats of the railroad workers. To demonstrate the procedure of the railroad unions, the following major proposals are fundamentally necessary: the right of the membership to vote on all wage settlements, their right to recall elected officials by majority vote at any time, more democratically organized conventions, which should be held biennially and the officers' reports published 30 days in advance, election, not appointment, of convention committees, free discussion of all economic and political questions and opinions in the local meetings and official union journals, more strict and businesslike system of financial accounts, compulsory retirement of union officials at the age of 65. Especially is it necessary to put an end to the undemocratic and generally harmful practice of paying union officials such large salaries and expense accounts that they live like capitalists and lose all feeling as workers. The practice of looking into workers' political beliefs as a basis for their membership in the union or eligibility for official positions should be abolished. True trade union democracy accepts all honorable workers as members without regard to their race, sex, religion, age, nationality, or political opinion. 5. Another important democratic reform necessary to the railroad unions is to broaden out and strengthen the grievance committees along the lines of the new shop steward system of CIO unions. The present grievance and bargaining committees of the unions in the railroad industry are too narrow, too much the affair only of paid officials. This is wrong. Every negotiating committee, from the bottom to the top, should be heavily rank and file in composition. The experiences in the auto, steel, and other industries prove the enormous importance of having a well-knit system of shop stewards for each department, shop, plant, etc. Such a shop steward system, adapted to railroad conditions, would greatly strengthen the unions. It would enormously facilitate organization work, would put an end to the harmful chiseling against existing agreements that the companies are carrying on everywhere. To accomplish these basically necessary measures to strengthen the railroad unions, federation, amalgamation, democratization, it is indispensable that the progressive groups in the unions should campaign vigorously for them among the union members. Of the foregoing proposals, there is not one that the broad rank and file would not favor if given a free expression of opinion. But the bulk of the conservative officialdom is against these measures, and the unions are so undemocratically run that the will of the leaders, not the membership, is what ordinarily prevails. This situation can be changed by raising these questions among the membership, by making them live issues in every local union, in every local and system federation, in every international union convention, by filling the dry-as-dust official union journals with discussions of them. The great rank-and-file membership can be stirred to demand these measures, and once this is done, the conservative officials will either drop their opposition or be supplanted by more progressive leaders. The advance of the railroad unions to a powerful and democratic industrial federation of all railroad workers will come when the progressive elements in the unions set out earnestly to bring it to pass. Toward government ownership. In order that improved conditions should prevail in the railroad industry regarding wages, rates, service, financing, etc., it is not enough that the present wage cut be defeated. It is further imperatively necessary that the whole railroad system become the property of the federal government. There must be an end to the absurd and harmful conditions where these great arteries of commerce, vital public services, are owned and exploited by private individuals. The history of private ownership of the railroads is a long story of brutal exploitation of the workers, holding up of shippers and the public for excessive freight and passenger rates, criminal stock gambling and thievery, illegal rate rebating, bribery of legislators, and similar practices. It is a record of corruption and barefaced robbery without parallel in the world. Nationalization, government ownership, will finish off this regime. In establishing such nationalization, it is basically necessary drastically to reduce the present excessive capitalization of the roads. This should be cut in half at least, for most of it is water, and not pure water at that. Just recently, the Chicago and Great Western, bankrupt like 1/3 of the total railroad mileage from financial plundering and mismanagement, went through Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, reorganization proceedings, and consequently the capitalization of the road was slashed from $139 million to $62 million, or more than one half. Approximately the same thing should be done with the railroad system as a whole. Their frictious figure of some $24 billion capitalization should be reduced to about $10 or $12 billion, the actual replacement cost of the roads, and the market value of their securities. The bondholders must also take a reduction in their interest rates, as well as their capitalization, for why should they be paid 5 to 8% when government bonds draw only 2 or 3%? Of course, the stockholders will put up a big squawk against this devaluation, but in the real readjustment of the railroads to new traffic conditions, including the many new forms of competition and general industrial depression, the owners must accept substantial reductions in their profits. The workers, who are least able to stand sacrifices, have suffered to the extent of over 1 million of them losing their jobs outright and the rest becoming grossly overworked. Actually, the railroad security holders have only very dubious claims to the ownership of the railroads. In the first place, the roads were built pretty much from public subsidies and land grants. In the early days, for example, the federal government gave the railroads, after brazen corruption of Congress members, 160 million acres of rich farm, mineral, and timberlands, or a stretch of territory worth billions and equal in extent to the states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. The case of the Central Pacific was pretty typical. Besides gigantic land grants, it received a government subsidy of $86 million to build a road which actually cost but $42 million. The original owners put in only $108,987, but up till now, they have pulled down about $800 million in profits, or enough to rebuild the road several times over. Since the beginning of the railroad industry, its private owners have been paid back in dividends and graft many times the value of the roads. Thus, in the last 17 years, they have raked in unearned profits of $14 billion, or about 1.5 times the actual value of the roads. Yet the railroads still belong 100% to these private owners, and they hope to go right on owning them regardless of how many times the people pay for them. In strict justice, the big railroad-owning banks and corporations would be entitled to nothing for surrendering up the railroads to their rightful owners, the people. In the basic financial reorganization, however, care must be taken to protect the interest of the small stockholders who have bought gold brick railroad securities in good faith. During the industrial crisis years, the government has loaned and given the railroads several $100 million, most of which went to fatten interest and dividend rates, and now the roads are clamoring for more. But should any further loans be granted, they should definitely be utilized as steps towards government ownership. The government should insist that such funds be used to make work by rehabilitating the badly run-down railroads, that they should be secured by first mortgages, and that the government should have representation on the Railroad Board of Directors. When nationalization of the railroads is finally carried through, there are a number of improved labor conditions which the railroad workers should insist upon as part of the new setup. Among them are union representation in the management, the establishment of a standard minimum working force, no consolidations at the cost of workers, jobs, the 6-hour day, full crew and train limit regulations, the improvement of the old age and unemployment insurance laws, the reduction of excessive managerial salaries, better promotion systems, and the working out of a national coordinated transportation system to include bus and electric lines, trucking systems, pipelines, steamships, airplanes, etc., under a federal Department of Transportation, and the greatest care will have to be exercised to protect the strike rights of the workers. The question of government ownership of the railroads has become a vital question. The railroad unions, the AFL, NCIO, and many other organizations favor it. The present critical situation on the railroads, caused by the employers' unjustified wage cut demands, stresses afresh its urgency. The railroad unions should push the question with all vigor, as they used to do in the days of the Plum Plan. The railroad unions and Jim Crow. In the present sharp controversy over the discrimination against Negro workers in the railroad industry, there has been a widespread tendency to condemn the trade unions roundly as mainly responsible for the discrimination or, at best, as equally guilty with the railroad companies. But putting the greater responsibility upon the trade unions lends itself easily to anti-union propaganda. Without in the least wishing to excuse the trade unions which practice discrimination against Negro workers, the truth remains, nevertheless, that the railroad corporations themselves are the ones primarily responsible for inflicting this infamous system upon the vast railroad services. It is an historical fact that the railroad companies introduced Jim Crow upon the railroads as they built them. It is clear that the unions had nothing to do with the original establishment of Jim Crow, because there were no trade unions in existence at that time on the railroads. The railroad unions which now practice discrimination are in the position of having accepted these infamous methods, established long ago by the companies, and then of having, in many cases, collaborated with the companies in making them worse. The representatives of the railroad companies, at the hearings of the Fair Employment Practice Committee, FEPC, in Washington a couple of months ago, undertook to excuse away their discrimination against the hiring of Negro workers by stating that in doing so they were merely conforming to a widespread social prejudice which they could not change. By implication, they blame the unions as the instigators. That is all a lie, and that the railroads themselves have been a reactionary influence in this whole matter is made obvious by the fact that in the South, where anti-Negroism is the most rampant and where the companies might there be expected to be the most restricted in their employment practices, actually the companies' hiring policies have always been, ever since the railroads were first built, far more liberal than in the North, where Jim Crow is less virulent generally. Thus, in the South, the railroad companies, from the start, hired numbers of Negro workers in the more skilled trades, including firemen, switchmen, brakemen, shop mechanics, etc. Whereas in the North, these occupations on the railroads from the earliest days have been almost completely barred to Negroes. The explanation of this seeming contradiction is that in the South, the railroad companies, in order to meet the labor shortage, were compelled to turn to the great body of available Negroes, the number of immigrants reaching those sections being small. In the North, however, where the railroad companies had huge numbers of white immigrants at their disposal, they, acting in a real Jim Crow spirit, practically excluded the Negroes altogether from the railroads, save in the Pullman sleeping and dining car services. This was quite in line with the company's anti-union policies. They're playing native-born workers against foreign-born, they're pitting whites against Negroes, etc. When the railroad trade unions began to come into existence and to be a factor in determining railroad working conditions, along in the 1880s and 1890s, they found the Jim Crow system in full force all over the national railroad network, in the North as well as in the South. The union's weakness was that they fell in with this discrimination and, hearkening to the demands of the most backward elements within their own ranks, they have even worsened the existing Jim Crow practices by denying Negroes union membership and by making discriminatory agreements with the railroad companies against the hiring of Negroes. Such conduct has been absolutely inexcusable on their part. What the railroad unions have lacked is a leadership intelligent enough to understand the common interest of all workers, regardless of the colors of their skin, and bold enough to smash through the Jim Crow system, originally established by the companies. What will the railroad unions do now that the issue of abolishing Jim Crow has been made acute by the recent decision of the FEPC? The attitude of the Southern Railroad companies, in defiantly refusing to obey the anti-discrimination order of the FEPC, is a giveaway of the historical anti-Negro position of the railroad companies generally. It is to be hoped, however, that the railroad unions themselves will not follow this reactionary lead, but will finally break with the infamous discrimination system, regardless of the wishes of the railroad companies. Such action is indispensable, in justice to the Negro people, in the best interests of the trade union movement, and in the furtherance of our national war effort. The whole labor movement, at this crucial juncture, should give the heartiest support to the FEPC order and to the elimination of Jim Crowism in all industries and unions. 1944. That is the end of Chapter 28 of American Trade Unionism. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. Have a good day.